They were the children of war, born not to live but to die beautifully. In the rugged hills of ancient Greece, where the earth bled red beneath the feet of warriors, a single city dared to forge perfection. Sparta, the name still carries the sound of iron and discipline, a word whispered through history like a battle cry that never died. To the outside world, the Spartans were gods in human form, men sculpted from stone, unbroken, unyielding, fearless in the face of death. They were the guardians of Greek glory, the legends of Thermopylae, the embodiment of human strength and sacrifice. But myths are merciful lies, and behind the polished armor was something far darker. For the Spartans, life itself was a weapon to be sharpened. From the moment of birth, the state decided who was worthy to breathe, and who was better left to the cold mountain winds. A child's first judgment was not love, but inspection. Every heartbeat, every breath, every drop of blood was property of the state. A Spartan did not belong to his mother nor his father, he belonged to Sparta. His destiny carved long before his first word, his worth measured only by his ability to serve and to kill. This was not a society of men, it was a breeding ground for war, a place where compassion was weakness, where tenderness was treason, and where even motherhood was reduced to a sacred duty of production. Behind the heroism of Leonidas and the glory of Thermopylae lies a truth soaked in silence, a system built on control, cruelty, and design. Before a Spartan could lift a spear, before he could march into legend, the path to perfection began in the cradle. And in Sparta, not every cradle was meant to be filled. Far from the marble columns and poets of Athens, hidden behind mountains and rivers, there stood a city carved from silence, Sparta. It had no shining temples to the arts, no theaters filled with laughter, no philosophers arguing beneath the sun. Sparta was different. It was built not for beauty, but for survival. Isolation was its strength. Surrounded by enemies and slaves, hemmed in by harsh terrain, Sparta turned inward, and in doing so, turned cold. Every law, every ritual, every breath served one purpose, to ensure the city never fell. For the Spartans, fear was not something to be conquered, it was something to be bred out. They believed the state was a living body, and its citizens were the bones, the blood, the sinew that kept it standing. An individual had no identity beyond the whole. His joy, his grief, even his children, all belonged to Sparta. This was not a place for dreamers. Here, the gods of love and freedom had no shrines. Here, the only god that mattered was war. The Spartan philosophy was brutally simple. The state was everything, and the individual was nothing. A man did not live for himself, but for the phalanx, the wall of shields that defined Spartan strength. In Sparta, life was not personal, it was political. The city had no room for weakness, no patience for imperfection. To be Spartan was to surrender every trace of softness, every whisper of self, to the will of the collective. And in this sacrifice, they believed, lay immortality. But to forge such a people, Sparta could not rely on mere training. It needed control at the deepest level, control of blood, birth, and body. The Agoge, the famous Spartan upbringing, was not just an education system. It was social engineering, the careful construction of the perfect human weapon. From the age of 7, boys were torn from their families and thrown into a life of hunger, pain, and competition. They learned not how to live, but how to endure. Every moment tested them, every wound was a lesson. To steal was not punished if done with skill. To suffer was a badge of honor. By the time they reached manhood, their hearts were armored as heavily as their bodies. They feared neither death nor pain. They feared only dishonor. But the Agoge was merely the second step in a far older design. Before the boy could be trained, he had to be born. And even that was a matter of calculation. Spartans did not believe in raising children, one ancient historian wrote. They believed in creating weapons. From the moment a Spartan woman conceived, her body was no longer her own. She was a vessel, a forge in which the next generation of warriors was crafted. Women trained in running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin, not for vanity, but for vitality. Their strength, it was said, would shape the strength of their sons. And when the child came into the world, his life depended not on love, but on judgment. Elders examined every infant, testing limbs, spine, and voice. If he was strong, he was given to the state. If not, he was left to the cold. This was the first law of perfection. The weak must die so the strong may thrive. To the Spartans, this was not cruelty. It was logic. They believed the gods favored strength, that by purging imperfection, they honored the divine. In Sparta, mercy was a sin, and compassion was a disease that weakened the city. Only through discipline, they believed, could humanity transcend its chaos. At the center of this brutal order stood a shadowed figure, Lycurgus, the lawgiver. No one truly knows if he lived or if he was myth, but his ghost ruled Sparta for centuries. They said he traveled the world, saw its corruption, and returned with a single vision: to create a society where virtue was enforced by law and strength replaced freedom. Lycurgus forbade luxury, outlawed gold, and made equality compulsory. But it was equality through obedience, not compassion. His laws dictated how men fought, how women bore children, even how infants were judged. Every aspect of life, from marriage to meals, was planned to breed discipline and destroy desire. He gave Sparta a soul made of iron, and then vanished into legend. Some say he starved himself to death so his laws could never be undone. Others say he was never real at all, merely the embodiment of the Spartan ideal: cold, pure, unrelenting. Under Lycurgus's shadow, the Spartan dream flourished and festered. They conquered their neighbors, enslaved entire populations, and lived surrounded by fear and hatred. To survive, they hardened even further. The result was astonishing: a city that produced warriors unmatched in history. 300 Spartans at Thermopylae could stand against thousands and die without a cry of fear. But the price of such power was monstrous. Their perfection demanded the sacrifice of individuality, emotion, and compassion. To be Spartan was to be both revered and imprisoned, trapped within an unbreakable ideal. They called it virtue. We might call it obsession. And as their system grew more rigid, Sparta began to lose the one thing it sought to perfect: life itself. Few births, fewer families, a society of warriors, but no children to replace them. The pursuit of the perfect soldier was slowly killing the city that created him. Sparta's vision of perfection began as strength, but it would end in silence. A city that sought to breed gods found only ghosts. Yet before that decline, their control would reach even deeper, into marriage, love, and conception itself. For in Sparta, even creation was an act of war. In Sparta, birth was not a beginning. It was a test. When a Spartan child entered the world, his first audience was not his mother's arms, but the judgment of the state. No lullaby greeted him, no gentle whisper of love. Only silence, and eyes trained to find flaw. The ritual was ancient, older than memory itself. Soon after birth, the infant was carried from the home and brought before a council of elders, men whose faces had long forgotten pity. These were the guardians of Spartan purity, appointed to decide which lives were worth the city's breath. They lifted the newborn in their calloused hands, inspecting his body like a piece of bronze. They studied his limbs, the shape of his head, the sound of his cry. Was the body straight and strong? Did the child grip a finger with power? Did he scream with the voice of one who would someday command? If yes, he was accepted, given a name, and returned to his mother, who would raise him not as her son, but as a future soldier. If not, the elders gave no speech, no ceremony. They simply turned their gaze away. And that was the end. The unwanted child would be carried to a desolate place, a cliffside at the foot of Mount Taygetus, where the rocks met the wind. There the infant would be left alone, no grave, no marker, only the cold and the silence of a world that had already decided he did not deserve to exist. To the Spartans, this was not murder. It was purification. They believed that the weak endangered the whole. That imperfection was infection and must be cut away. A malformed body meant a malformed soul. A crying mother meant a disobedient citizen. And so, emotion was smothered under the weight of duty. The women of Sparta learned early what this meant. They were praised for their strength, admired for their endurance, yet their power was never truly their own. Their wombs served the city, their hearts trained to obey its laws. When a child was taken to be judged, a Spartan mother was expected to remain silent. She could not plead, she could not protest. For to cry was to question the will of Sparta, and in this city, even grief was treason. They called this silence virtue. A mother's tears were a sign of weakness, and weakness was the enemy. It was said that when Spartan women gathered after such losses, they would look not to the heavens for comfort, but to one another, and remind themselves, a Spartan mother does not ask if her son lived, only if he fought bravely. This was the creed that shaped them. Love was allowed, but only if it served the state. Pride replaced mourning. Obedience replaced tenderness. Imagine the sound. The soft cries of an infant carried away by the wind, fading into nothingness. And the mother, standing in her doorway, staring toward the mountains but never moving. Because she was told that to save her city, she must let her child die. This was the true cost of Spartan greatness. Every warrior who stood at Thermopylae was born from a system that began with blood and silence. For every perfect soldier that Sparta produced, there were countless tiny bodies left among the stones. The city of heroes was built on their absence. To outsiders, this practice was monstrous. Even other Greeks whispered of Sparta's cruelty. But to the Spartans themselves it was sacred, a divine duty ordained by law and legend. They believed their founder, Lycurgus, had demanded it. In his vision, the state was a living organism, and every child was a cell within it. The unfit would weaken the body, threaten its strength, and doom its survival. Thus, elimination became a moral act, cruelty disguised as devotion. And so, the ritual endured. Generation after generation, infants were tested, weighed, and judged. The mountain became a silent cemetery without graves, a monument not to death, but to discipline. What kind of society teaches its mothers not to weep? What kind of people find pride in loss? The answer lies in the psychology of Spartan life itself. From birth, every citizen was told that their body, their soul, even their family belonged to Sparta. There was no I, only we. The mother who gave her child to death was not pitied. She was honored. Songs were sung of her devotion, not her grief. She had obeyed the highest law, that no weakness must survive to poison the state. And so, women became the silent architects of Spartan cruelty, both victims and enforcers of a faith that demanded the death of the undeserving. They carried this burden with cold pride, believing that by sacrificing love, they created legends. But legends are cruel things. They glorify the result, never the cost. In time, even the act of birth became a symbol of the city's power. To live was not a right, it was a privilege granted by the state. A newborn was not seen as a person, but as potential. His first cry was not a plea for love, it was a test of worth. This was the second law of perfection. Life existed only for the strong. And so Sparta endured, purified, sharpened, and hollowed from within. For in their pursuit of strength, they had done what no enemy ever could. They had stripped away the humanity that makes survival worth the pain. By the time a Spartan child could walk, he already carried the weight of expectation. He was alive not because he was loved, but because he was useful. And soon, that usefulness would be tested again. For even those who survived the judgment of the mountain were not spared. Their real trial, the Agoge, was still to come. In most of Greece, love was a dance. It filled poetry, sculpture, and song, the sweet madness of the heart made eternal through art. But in Sparta, love was dissected, measured, and controlled. It was not passion, it was policy. Where Athens celebrated beauty as divine inspiration, Sparta treated it as raw material, flesh to be molded, blood to be refined. Here, even the most intimate act of human connection was stripped of tenderness and transformed into statecraft. For the Spartans, creating life was never a private affair. It was a duty, a calculation, a matter of national survival. From birth to death, the city owned its citizens, and when it came to creating the next generation, the state intervened without hesitation. Marriage was not a matter of affection, but of fitness. Only the strongest men and the healthiest women were encouraged, or permitted, to breed. The weak were forbidden, the infertile, shamed, the old, ignored. Love had no place in this equation. It was irrelevant. The Spartan ideal was perfection, physical, moral, and military. And in pursuit of it, even reproduction became a battlefield. Young men were not allowed to live with their wives until they were 30. Until then, they remained in the barracks, sleeping, training, and eating alongside their brothers in arms. Marriage existed in name only. It was more ritual than reality. When these men were finally permitted to visit their wives, it was done in secret, under the cover of darkness. They slipped into their own homes like strangers, stealing moments of union between drills and duties. The purpose was not romance, it was reproduction. Sparta believed that desire dulled discipline, that affection distracted from duty. Even marriage was designed to keep the soldier loyal first to his country, not his spouse. He was a husband only in form. In spirit, he belonged entirely to the phalanx. But the true measure of control went further still. When a man was strong and brave but his wife could not bear children, the state intervened. The solution was chillingly practical. If another man, one of proven vigor, of noble blood or perfect form, was believed capable of producing stronger offspring, he could be given access to the wife. And the husband, bound by Spartan law, was expected to allow it. There was no shame in this, no scandal. It was seen as an act of civic duty. The goal was clear, to breed excellence. The reverse could also occur. If a woman was strong and healthy but her husband was frail or aged, the state could command her to conceive with another, a younger, more vital warrior. Marriage was no longer sacred, it was logistical. The human body had become an instrument of national policy. A husband's pride, a wife's choice, a family's privacy, all were sacrificed to the altar of Spartan perfection. And through it all, the city told itself it was righteous. They believed that by mastering love, by stripping it of weakness, they had achieved something purer, an unfeeling, unbreakable unity between body and state. But what they truly achieved was a kind of quiet horror. In Athens, sculptors carved the human form to honor its beauty, the curve of a muscle, the grace of a smile, the poetry of flesh made divine. In Sparta, the same form was studied like a weapon. The body was not sacred. It was a machine to be optimized, replicated, perfected. The Greeks worshipped Aphrodite, goddess of love. The Spartans worshipped no one like her. For them, love was not a blessing. It was a threat, something that might soften the warrior's resolve, weaken his edge, distract him from the cold clarity of discipline. And so, they caged it. They sterilized it. They made it serve their cause. Love was not sacred in Sparta, the voice of history whispers. It was a tool, a weapon, to create the perfect body. In this pursuit, they built one of the strangest societies in human history. Men and women were partners not in affection, but in function. Marriage was a breeding contract. Desire was state-sanctioned only when it served utility. Even beauty itself, the ideal so worshipped across the Greek world, was weaponized. A beautiful body was valuable only if it was strong. A handsome face meant nothing without muscle behind it. They bred not for charm or grace, but for power. The Spartan believed that a perfect society could only exist if every birth was deliberate, every union designed, every weakness eliminated before it began. And yet, beneath this structure of control, a quiet emptiness grew. Without love, the act of creation became mechanical, efficient, but soulless. Without freedom, even perfection became a prison. Behind closed doors, some couples still whispered to each other, fleeting traces of tenderness that dared to exist in defiance of the law. But those whispers were dangerous. In a city where the state owned every part of you, even your heart, to love freely was rebellion. The irony is cruel. Sparta sought to create immortality through strength, but by denying the very emotions that make us human, it bred itself into extinction. Few new children were born, families dwindled, and as generations passed, the once mighty population of full citizens, the Spartiates, withered away. The machine that had been built to produce perfection began to consume itself. The system that tried to conquer love was undone by its absence. Sparta's legacy still echoes, its warriors immortalized in legend, its discipline admired, its glory remembered. But the truth beneath that glory is far colder. Behind the bronze armor and the shining spears was a society that dared to control creation itself, to command who could love, who could live, and who could die. In their pursuit of perfection, the Spartans may have created the strongest warriors the world has ever known. But they also proved that a world without love, no matter how strong, cannot endure. By the time a Spartan boy reached the age of 7, his childhood was over. No toys, no lullabies, no warmth of home. He was taken from his mother's arms, not as punishment, but as destiny. The child she had carried, the son she had barely known, now belonged entirely to the state. This was the beginning of the Agoge, Sparta's great experiment in perfection, a system designed to strip a boy of everything soft, everything human, until nothing remained but the will to obey and the strength to kill. They called it education. But what it truly was transformation. The boys were gathered into units, known as herds, each led by an older youth, not much older, but already hardened by years of discipline. They lived together in barracks, sleeping on reeds, clothed in a single rough cloak that served for both winter and summer. Food was scarce by design. Hunger was a teacher, one that gnawed at the spirit until obedience became survival. They learned early that mercy would not feed them. If they wanted more, they had to take it, from nature, from others, from anyone weaker. And so, they learned to steal, not for greed, but for life, to hunt, to deceive, to outthink and outfight. But if they were caught, the punishment was not for the theft. It was for being discovered. Sparta valued cunning as much as courage. To steal well was to show intelligence, to be caught was to show failure. Pain became the price of imperfection. Every day they were tested. The instructors beat them for errors, for hesitations, for weakness of voice or body. To cry was forbidden. Tears were for the unworthy. They were taught that emotion was a fracture in the armor of the soul, and Sparta could not afford cracks. When one boy faltered, the rest paid with lashes. When one hesitated, all suffered. Discipline was absolute, and unity was survival. Through pain, they learned to move as one body, one will, a human phalanx in training. At night, the barracks were filled with silence. No songs, no laughter, only the sound of breathing, shallow, careful, measured. Even in sleep, they were watched. Their instructors entered without warning, testing them in darkness, striking at random, demanding alertness even in dreams. Fear was constant, deliberate, and sacred. To live in fear was to live in awareness, and awareness was the beginning of strength. And yet, beneath the iron of their discipline, something was dying. The boys no longer remembered what it meant to be held, to be comforted, to be forgiven. They learned to see pain not as cruelty, but as love. The only kind Sparta knew how to give. Every lash, every scar, every sleepless night was a message whispered through blood. You are not a child. You are a weapon. By adolescence, their bodies were carved from endurance. Their minds emptied of doubt. They moved with precision, killed without hesitation, and obeyed without thought. But the Agoge was not complete without its darkest ritual, the final proof of loyalty and ruthlessness. The instructors sent the boys into the wild to hunt the helots, the enslaved people who worked the fields and served the city. It was called the Cryptia. To outsiders, it was a test of stealth. To the Spartans, it was purification. The boys learned to stalk in silence, to kill without remorse. They crept through the night, murdering unarmed slaves to prove their worth. Each death was a lesson, not in hatred, but in obedience. For if they could kill without question, they could fight without fear. In time, these boys forgot the sound of compassion. They learned that to hesitate before killing was betrayal, that to pity the weak was to dishonor the strong. A Spartan child was not raised, he was forged. They had stripped away empathy, individuality, and innocence, and replaced it with something the world had never seen before, a unity of body and mind so absolute that even death could not break it. This was the perfection they sought. Not happiness, not peace, but control. The Agoge was not just training, it was erasure, a slow, deliberate unmaking of everything that made a boy human. He entered it as a child. He emerged as an instrument. Each generation was shaped by the same design, conceived by the strongest, judged at birth, hardened through pain, and perfected through violence. The entire Spartan system, from the mother's womb to the soldier's grave, was one unbroken chain of control, and for a time it worked. Sparta became a legend, its warriors feared by empires, its discipline worshipped by nations. But even legends have shadows. The same system that produced the strongest soldiers the world had ever known also created men who could not live without war. When the fighting stopped, they were lost. Their strength meant nothing in peace. Their hearts, long silenced, could no longer remember how to feel. They were perfect soldiers and hollow men. They learned to steal not for greed, the story goes, but for survival. And in the end, that is all Sparta ever did. It stole from its own children, their childhood, their freedom, their humanity, and called it glory. Only those bred and molded could survive the Agoge. Only those who had never been allowed to feel could endure it. The rest, the ones who might have been poets, dreamers, lovers, were lost before they ever began. They were erased, sacrificed to the myth of strength. And in their silence, Sparta built its name upon the bones of the young. In most of ancient Greece, women were shadows, silent figures behind closed doors, veiled in obedience. But in Sparta, they walked in the open. They trained their bodies, they spoke their minds, and they held the gaze of men without fear. To outsiders, they seemed free, powerful, almost untouchable. But beneath that proud image was a truth as hard and cold as iron. Their strength did not belong to them. It belonged to Sparta. From the moment a Spartan girl could walk, her body was shaped by the same brutal ideals that ruled her brothers. While Athenian girls were taught weaving and modesty, Spartan girls ran, wrestled, and raced. They threw javelins and lifted weights. They trained in endurance, in speed, in precision. Their childhoods crafted not for beauty, but for breeding. Their bodies were not their own. They were temples, and the gods they served were not divine, but political. The state demanded that women be strong, not for their own glory, but to bear sons who would survive the Agoge. Every muscle, every heartbeat, every breath was preparation for motherhood, for producing the next generation of warriors. This was not empowerment, it was engineering. The ideal Spartan woman was both fierce and unyielding. She was expected to stand tall while her husband marched to war, to feel pride, not fear. When she gave birth, she was not swaddled in comfort. Her pain was a duty, her joy conditional. A weak child was a shame, a dead one, if unfit, a sacrifice for the greater good. They said Spartan mothers did not weep. They said their tears would dishonor the dead. And so they smiled through grief. They stood over the graves of their sons, whispering the only words that mattered. Come back with your shield, or on it. Not a wish, a command. To return victorious, or not at all. This was the paradox of Spartan womanhood. They were the most liberated women in the ancient world, owning land, managing estates, and commanding respect. But every freedom they held was bound in the chains of expectation. Their worth was measured not in gold or wit or loyalty, but in the strength of the children they produced, and the courage with which they let them die. The state had turned motherhood into a weapon. Marriage was never about love, it was ceremony, function, design. When a woman was married, her husband did not come home to her. He lived in the barracks until the age of 30. Their meetings were brief, arranged in secrecy, often at night. Sparta wanted passion disciplined, affection controlled, desire reduced to biology. Even within marriage, a woman's body was not truly hers. If a man was deemed weak or infertile, the state could permit another, stronger, younger, to father her children. It was not shameful, it was patriotic. In this way, the private act of creation became an act of state service. Love was irrelevant. Legacy was everything. Yet for all the control imposed upon them, Spartan women were not silent victims. They learned to speak with fire. Their words carried weight, even in the council of men. A Spartan queen could scold a king. A mother could mock a coward. And a widow could wear pride as armor. It was said that Spartan women were the only ones who could give birth to men. And perhaps that was true, because they had to be stronger than anyone else just to survive in a world that demanded they smile while their children died. But even strength has a shadow. Behind the steel of their pride, there were cracks, unspoken, unseen. How many mothers whispered their children's names into the night when no one could hear? How many prayed to God Sparta had forgotten, begging that their sons might live, even if it meant dishonor? Their hearts beat for Sparta, but their blood beat for something older, the ancient instinct to protect, to love. And that was the cruelest part of their power. They were forced to bury their humanity beneath duty, to kill the mother within so that the soldier could be born. In a world built on control, they were the silent architects. Without them, there would be no warriors, no phalanx, no legend, no Sparta. They carried the future in their wombs and the past in their silence. Their strength was not the power to choose, it was the endurance to accept. They stood as the backbone of the Spartan machine, holding their heads high while the world mistook their servitude for freedom. Come back with your shield, or on it. Those words were both blessing and curse, the anthem of a city that demanded perfection, not peace. And so the Spartan woman stood eternal, strong, proud, and utterly alone. She was not a wife, not merely a mother. She was a vessel of the state, the quiet engine of a civilization that built its glory on sacrifice, freedom in form, servitude in purpose. And in that paradox lay the soul of Sparta, a world where even love was a weapon, and even the womb was a battlefield. The city that once roared with the sound of marching feet fell silent. The clang of bronze shields, the shouts of boys in training, the hymns to war, all began to fade. What remained were echoes and ghosts. Sparta, the city that claimed to have bred gods, was dying. Not from defeat, not from invasion, but from within. For centuries, they had believed that strength alone could make a people eternal. That if the bloodline stayed pure, if the weak were cast out, and the strong exalted, they would never fall. But nature, like fate, despises perfection. And the tighter Sparta tried to grip its own creation, the faster it slipped through its fingers. The breeding laws once seen as divine became a curse. Each generation, fewer children were born, and even fewer were deemed fit. The same purity they worshipped had become their prison. Their obsession with control strangled their future. Spartan men, bound to barracks until 30, lived and died in loyalty to the state, but not to love. Marriage came too late, families too few, children too rare. The city that had once swelled with warriors began to empty. The training fields that once echoed with the cries of boys now stood quiet under the sun. They had won every battle against flesh and fear but lost the war against time. The irony was cruel. The system that sought immortality through perfection had planted the seeds of extinction in its own soil. They had killed mercy, banished compassion, silenced tenderness, all in the name of strength. But without those things, what was left to fight for? Spartans no longer lived for glory, only for duty. No laughter, no poetry, no love songs, only discipline, only silence. And silence, when it lingers long enough, becomes death. By the 4th century BCE, the cracks began to show. Sparta's once mighty army dwindled, not from defeat, but from emptiness. There were simply not enough true Spartans left to fill the ranks. The Helots, the enslaved underclass they had ruled by terror, began to outnumber them 100-1. The warriors who once commanded fear now looked over their shoulders, haunted by their own creation. The Agoge continued, but its halls grew thinner each year. The state still inspected newborns, still trained boys, still bred bodies like livestock, but the fire was gone. They had perfected obedience, and in doing so, extinguished life. Philosophers later called it fate. Historians called it consequence. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Sparta had forgotten what it meant to be human. They had stripped away weakness until there was nothing left to feel. They had turned love into function, birth into duty, childhood into endurance. In their quest to breed gods, they created emptiness. A hollow civilization where perfection replaced passion and discipline devoured the soul. The children of war had become the ghosts of their own creation. As centuries passed, their walls still stood, but the heart had stopped beating. No new warriors came to fill the ranks. No mothers sang lullabies into the night. The fields lay barren, and the training yards filled with dust. Where once boys fought for honor, now only the wind moved, whispering through the ruins of barracks and temples, carrying with it the echoes of a world that had forgotten how to love. And yet, their legend endured. Even today, we speak the name Sparta with awe, as if those warriors still march through history, immortal in their discipline and courage. But the truth beneath that legend is darker. Their greatness came not from strength, but from sacrifice. The sacrifice of joy, of tenderness, of humanity itself. They built a paradise for warriors and a prison for souls. Perhaps in the end, the gods pitied them. Perhaps they saw that perfection is not the absence of weakness, but the balance of it. For what is strength, if not born from struggle? What is courage, if not touched by fear? The Spartans removed all that made them human, and in doing so, lost the very thing that made them divine. And so the city that had defied the world faded not in fire, but in silence. No armies came to burn it. No invaders tore it down. It simply withered. The last Spartans grew old, their bones brittle, their legacy cold. The mountains that once echoed with the cries of newborns now held only the whisper of wind and the faint memory of a dream that consumed itself. In their quest to breed gods, they forgot what it meant to be human. And the perfect city, the city born for war, died not with a scream, but with a whisper. The wind moves softly through the ruins of Sparta. Stone walls, broken and half-buried in dust, stand like the bones of giants, silent witnesses to a dream that devoured itself. No swords clash here now, no chants of boys in training, only the hollow breath of time whispering across a land once alive with war. Once, Sparta sought to create gods, men without fear, women without weakness, a people without flaw. But in chasing perfection, they carved away everything that made life worth living. Love became duty, childhood became trial, compassion became crime. They built their paradise on the graves of their own hearts. The world remembers their discipline, their courage, their defiance, but history forgets the cost. The mothers who never wept, the children who never played, the city that traded its soul for strength. And when that strength ran dry, nothing was left to hold it together. No laughter, no love, no life. Just silence. In the end, Sparta did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it forgot why it wanted to be strong. It is a lesson that echoes through every empire, every nation, every human heart that confuses control with greatness. Perfection is not life. It is the absence of it. And those who try to forge it in flesh and blood will always meet the same fate. So when we speak the name Sparta, we should whisper it not as praise, but as warning. Because every time humanity worships strength above compassion, every time we value obedience over empathy, a little part of Sparta is reborn. And the cycle begins again. They were the children of war, born not to live, but to die beautifully. But beauty, like perfection, cannot live without the heart that beats beneath it. And so the perfect city faded into dust, its legend eternal, its soul long gone.